wanted to introduce the two other folks on the panel. The first is Erika Best. Erika is the Associate Director for Direct Response with No Kid Hungry, which is part of Share Our Strength. And Nick Ellinger, who is VP of Marketing Strategy with DonorVoice. We're excited to have an opportunity to spend the next hour with you guys. Just a couple housekeeping things. We're going to be recording the call. We will also send out the recording and deck afterwards. In terms of asking questions, just raise your hand. There's a little function there, or just type into the chat, and we'll do our best to address that as we work through the process. And with that, I'll sort of kick this off. I'm gonna divide it into sort of three parts here. So I'm gonna run through a little bit of just the background of the whole approach, how we got here to some extent, and then we're gonna get into both how No Kid Hungry spoke to, sort of took that approach and applied it, and then the third part is really, how did it actually work once we applied those learnings in the market? What did that look like? So really testing the real life kind of approach. And like I said, we'll address any questions as we get through the presentation. So with that, I'll get started. Move to the next slide. So as I'm sure, if we were in an open setting here and I was asking this question, how many people are doing A/B testing these days? I would imagine there would be a lot of hand raising going on. And I think as we go through this process, the one thing I would keep in mind is that this is not suggesting A/B testing goes away. What we're suggesting is A/B testing has its flaws. Why this is on the screen is sort of an interesting example. And there was an organization, they had, they did two tests, as you can see. And as typical, you would, divide up the panels, and you'd have three panels. You'd have your control, and you'd have your two tests. These were mailed, and as you can see, the results, are varied. One test did better than the control and did better than the other test. Average gifts were varied. Revenue obviously impacted by those other metrics. And you would think, based on the performance of this test, that you would select test number one, because it seemed to deliver the best results. Ironically, though, what was found, and these results typically, statistically significant, in terms of the quantities and everything. And, as we also know that, through this process, improvements, if there are typically incremental at best. And obviously you're only evaluating one element at a time. So every time we have to do this, we have to evaluate another element. And as we've learned, when we roll these things out, they're not always 100%, because you find that when you roll it out, sometimes the results change. In this particular case, it turned out that there was an error made, and the same package got mailed to all three panels, which, obviously just sort of reinforced the fact that sometimes it doesn't always turn out the exact way you think it's going to. So as we walk through this process, what we're trying to look at is, how do we get to the point where we put things into the market, we can have better success at seeing the results of that testing. So it's not eliminating A/B testing, it's trying to sort of optimize it in a way and learn a lot more before we get there. Next slide. This is sort of another example of how we, typically, as you go through a process of brainstorming or coming up with ideas, it's an internal process where you you believe there are certain things that make sense or don't make sense. And so you might like something, a preference. This is an example of 20 different products and offers and ideas that were ranked based on donor preference and staff preference. So the red is staff and the donor is blue. And as it illustrates, the two aren't necessarily in the same place. So we're not always the best judge just based off of our own ideas as to what the donor is going to prefer. And that's really the point of it. And so how do we get better at understanding what the donor prefers? You know, there's the belief, you know, the same old thinking drives the same old results. And so how do we change the thinking to drive a better result? Next slide. And this is typically how you would go about developing your ideas. You would ideate, you would test, you would measure, and you would determine what the outcome is. And what we're suggesting is there's actually a process before that. So before we get to that, next slide, you add this research and analyze part, which is what we're going to talk about. How much better could you be, which we believe a lot, in then ideating, testing, and measuring in the market. And so the combination of the two can be extremely powerful, especially for organizations that are doing a lot of testing. And those that we have found are, you know, new to the marketplace, say in a particular channel, and they're trying to get some experience in understanding what the donor prefers. So we'll walk through a little bit of that. What we're suggesting is and this is not new, but the ability to understand and ask the people what they actually prefer. There's an approach that's called choice-based conjoint. Now, this is not something new. It's been in the commercial marketplace for several decades, couple decades. The idea is that it gets feedback from the audience to understand the importance of different attributes. And we'll talk about what those could be. What's really compelling is it can evaluate thousands of combinations at once. And so instead of trying to isolate an individual attribute and evaluate that in the market, which, you know, takes time and is expensive, you can evaluate many different things. We try and get as close to real world as possible. And the approach is pretty simple. We just ask them, you know, which one do you prefer? We gather all these results all at once pretty quickly. And the other compelling part is it's sort of, and we'll talk about an example, is you can sort of road test some risky ideas because you're not going to the entire marketplace. You're going to a very limited universe of people. And the power of the multiple allows you to do that because you can present to a relatively small group of people, in most cases about 300, many different ideas, and then the power of that group looking at all of these different ideas allows you to statistically evaluate this impact through this conjoint, this choice-based conjoint. So it creates a pretty compelling platform to try a lot of different things. So step one is the brainstorm. What would we want to know, right? So you still have to start with, you know, our ideas. And this is what we refer to as the grid. And the grid is really an opportunity to lay out, as you can see on the left-hand side, these different types of attributes. These are just examples, you know, who you help. So it could really be an audience, excuse me, an audience definition. It could be, you know, how would you identify your audiences? So, and you would have multiple versions of that. It could be, you know, it could be a parent, it could be a child, it could be other types of audiences that are going to be relevant to whatever type of organization you have. And then what's the reason to give? And so you can have many different statements that articulate a reason to give. Things that maybe are being considered internally that you aren't 100% sure of. This provides a way of laying those attributes out. The important part of this is, and so here's an example. So who you help, child, adult. Here are different descriptions of identities. In this case, it's a health charity, type 2 diabetes, and how that impacts versus type 1. And then you start to look at the different reasons. What kind of voice is it? In this case, it's a comparison between the CEO and a doctor. And donor control. That now it could be different attributes for your organization. We work collectively to identify what they are and then look at those versions. So everyone starts with this sort of framework, and this becomes that way of identifying through the brainstorming process all the possibilities. And you want it to be fairly broad and extreme to some extent. If things are too close to each other, you're not going to really get the full impact of what you can learn by understanding the range of people's preference. You don't always have to go with it, but you can understand it. And then we design for the test. And the design is, again, sort of trying to get to as close to real world as possible. And so we create a template. So everybody's presented with the same template. This is an example of what that template could look like. And it varies by organization, and obviously what you're trying to accomplish in terms of the different attributes and versions. But it uses a framework in order to identify, where the ask is going to be. In this case, an email, why women, what you identify. Then there's a gray box of behavioral science, which are specific techniques on how people are giving. And then you can sort of see that framework illustrated on the right. Very simple. And then this is how it's presented. So just for context, we start with, it's an email that is sent to a group of people on your donor file. And the segment, it can be an existing donor file, or it could be an outside panel that's selected if we're trying to evaluate potentially an acquisition audience. And they receive this email inviting them to participate in a very brief research study to evaluate and look for their opinion and what they prefer. They click on the link and they get to the study. That's a short series of questions or a short series of information that's presented to them. This is what they see. So very simple, and they have to choose either the one on the left or the one on the right. There's nothing to answer. They consume the information sort of all in one bucket and look at it, and they select the one they prefer. Obviously, they're reading it. So then once you've gone through this process where and it takes a very brief amount of time, and it's very, very rare that we've ever had an issue with not being able to get a completed set of surveys. And then on step 5, we analyze the data. What are the attributes? What attributes are most important? What messaging works the best? And do these vary by donor identity? There are scores that are actually created for each of the attributes and versions, so that you can essentially understand at the row level what works the best, or what is preferred the best, I should say. And through that process, you then assemble elements of what could be a package or an email or whatever particular execution you're trying to evaluate. And then from there, that's where we move to more of an in-market kind of validation of all the things that we believe through this process and through the statistical analysis is telling us are the things that donors prefer. it really gives you a strong platform and head, sort of leg up in being able to successfully drive a more effective test, validation test, which we have seen work over and over again. Nothing's 100%, but it will give you a lot of great learning as you inform the next phase of your process. So from here, I'm going to move into sort of the case study on Share Our Strength. Nick is going to sort of provide some context around how No Kid Hungry sort of took that approach and applied it to their study. And then we will move to sort of the in-market piece.
Thank you, and feel free to shout out any questions that you have in the question and answer, raise your hand or in the chat. Happy to answer any questions because we know the process for this can get a little bit complex. Thankfully, the execution is fairly simple, and hopefully the walkthrough of the methodology made sense. We're going to be brainstorming what things that we want to know as the result of the testing. We want to find out what types of those things we want to test. We then send that out to people who will select one version or another based on their preference, where they're randomizing in those attributes. And then from that, we can see how important an attribute is, and then what wins in that category. So let's look at what that did for No Kid Hungry. So going into our work with them, we wanted to learn how different types of donors, different donor identities, parents, foodies, those who had experienced a close connection to hunger at some point in their life, they'd have it, or someone they loved had been hungry at some point in their life, and religiosity in particular. We wanted to see how those different donor segments reacted to different types of messaging. So you'll see in here some creative that's aimed at those audiences. We also wanted to see how we talk about what the services that No Kid Hungry provides. No Kid Hungry isn't a food shelter, so it doesn't directly provide meals. Rather, it allows schools and communities to unlock existing funding to provide more meals to more kids outside of just reduced and free school lunches. How do we get kids breakfasts inside the school? How do we provide them an afternoon snack? How do we make sure that a child who's leaving Friday and may not be getting any food over the weekend has food in their belly when they leave school? What types of stories should we tell? Are they positive or negative? Are they individual or aspirational? And should we be talking about you provide this many meals or you help this many kids, those sorts of things? And then, like in the previous example, who should be talking from our organization? Is it our CEO? Is it a celebrity? Is it someone who's been impacted? All of those sorts of things. So what we tested were 5 attributes: who you're helping, some additional messaging, what you're providing with your gift, the voice from the organization, and then how do you perceive your impact to come through. It's important to realize that the columns here are rather meaningless. You're never going to see all of version 4 at a time necessarily, but on the left side of your screen you may see version 1 of who you help, version 2 of additional messaging, version 5 of what you provide, version 4 of the voice coming through, and version 1 of the perceived impact. That's on the left side. And on the right side, you'd see version 6 of who you're helping, version 1 of who additional messaging, version 1 of what you provide, version 5 of voice, and version 4 of perceived impact. So 2 randomized treatments of messaging, and you decide which one you prefer. And it's through that you're able to discover not only what works within an attribute, but what attributes are most important. With No Kid Hungry, the additional messaging was actually the most important, followed by perceived impact, what you feel that you're providing, followed by the voice of the organization. Less important, but still important, were who and how you're helping, and then what type of assistance you're providing. So if you get nothing else right, you need to get the additional messaging right, followed by the perceived impact. So let's go through those in order of importance. For additional messaging, No Kid Hungry's control messaging, 1 in 6 children in America, and there was a study out today that actually shows us that 1 in 7 children now struggle with hunger, down from 1 in 6. It used to be 1 in 5, so No Kid Hungry and its allies have been doing great work to help provide food to kids. But that 1 in 6 in this case struggle with hunger. Your support goes to meals. Second is what we called our foodie identity, that you're not just talking about you're giving someone a meal, but rather you're talking about the power of a meal to nourish, that it builds community, it helps, it's healthy. And No Kid Hungry acquires a lot of, or had acquired a number of its donors from Food Network placements. And so we had suspected that there was a foodie identity of people who wanted to hear more about the food that comes through. A word of note on the scoring that you see here, all of these scores are 1 out of 100. And you can look at them and say, if something's at a 40, something that's at an 80 is roughly twice as preferred as something that's at a 40. So generally speaking, if something's within 5 points of another, those are statistically tied. Once you get out of about a 5-point range, you do see statistically significant differences between these. So here we have a top tier of 2 messages that you can use very effectively, then a second tier of messaging that 80s are still very high messaging. So these are things that you can use, but perhaps not as primary messaging. So your support creates solutions that go beyond partisan politics, seems to resonate, especially in this day and age. And talking about children like Sophie, that individual voice, and we'll talk more about that individual person being helped later on. People didn't like as much the idea that your support helps kids in America. There are some folks who in their open-ended feedback say, I want to make sure my gift stays here in the United States, but that didn't come through as primary messaging. And then finally, in the seller, this was the worst creative that we had in terms of people choosing it throughout the Pretest tool, was that you're living out your faith with your gift. Now, to be sure, a number of people do give to No Kid Hungry because of their faith, but because it's a secular organization, they apparently expect the messaging, even religious people want the messaging coming out of No Kid Hungry to be secular, talking about what your gift does, rather than invoking religious ideals in particular. So that was something that we had seen people talking about in open-ended comments, wanted to test, but that's also why we do these tests in an environment where you're not rolling out with a religious package, because that type of messaging could have been fatal if rolled out with. Then talking about perceived impact, there's an idea from behavioral science of set completion. I want to give to help complete a set of items. And we said, do we want that set to be a meal, or do we want that set to be a classroom? And the winning concept here was the idea of a food pack. I want to give to one child a pack of food that will sustain them for the day. That's a breakfast, that's a healthy snack, and that's an after school meal. It also helps that that has a picture of food on it. No Kid Hungry's control calendar features food images, and you saw in the previous slide that a picture of food also did well there. So that foodie audience may be carrying through here. People also prefer to give to a set, as in a set of kids in a classroom. So the only difference between the one that scored 50 and the one that scored 48 is that it's an entire classroom of kids. So talking about that as a set as a slight addition. And you can see the big difference is between 66 here, the idea of a food pack, and 36, the idea of getting kids meals for an entire year. It's the same treatment, breakfast, after school meal, and a healthy snack, but putting into a set makes it far more appealing to the audience. So that's something that can be tested. In terms of voice, kids and parents won out. Those who are most directly impacted by the process. At the other end of the spectrum was the executive chairman of No Kid Hungry, at 24. And I must say that in all of the pretest tools that I've seen, and this may be lessons for your organizations on the phone, there has been only one circumstance in which an institutional voice, whether it's fundraising officer, or the executive chairman, or chairman of the board, all of those sorts of things, there's only been one time when that hasn't performed as the worst person to be signing letters. And that was with the American Diabetes Association. And it was because the CEO at the time said, I'm not just the CEO of the American Diabetes Association, I also suffer from diabetes. And so that identification pulled them out of the cellar and made that voice more salient to the donors, more relevant to them. But generally speaking, we do see those impacted by the mission being the most effective voices for the organization. So here, a child is in number one. Number two is that almost the same wording, but it's the parent talking about the child. Jeff Bridges is a celebrity spokesman for No Kid Hungry, and he came in third, ahead of a principal and ahead of Duff Goldman. We thought a Food Network celebrity, because of the nature of the organization, may come up in the ranks, and that did not apparently come to pass. Then in terms of who you help, we have two stories from the person being helped as our number one and number two, which is great. That's good data, but there's a significant difference even between those stories. The positive framing of what your gift does. When I eat a meal that you provide, it makes me smarter, it makes me think I can do anything, it makes me faster. That positive impact coming from that really came through for No Kid Hungry donors. Second place was I bring home ketchup packets and we make tomato soup from that, but that doesn't fill me up. That's a horrible story, and no child should ever have to go through that. And it is a compelling reason to give to No Kid Hungry, but the positive framing of that won out in this case. Some of the more broad examples of why you would give to No Kid Hungry and why you would want to provide meals, whether that's equal opportunity or long-term impacts or the stigma that comes from being the poor kid at school, those did not do as well as an individual person telling that story. And in terms of what you provide, missing meals as a concept won out significantly. So kids get free lunches, but they're missing these other meals, breakfasts, after school meals, and summer meals. Those are what you're providing. Now it's interesting because number one and number two have the same concepts. So actually, let's go back for a second because we have a question from the audience. Thank you. Since the message varies with each spokesperson, how can you be sure it's the message that's the relevant factor and not the spokesperson? What we did is we tried to tell the type of message that that spokesperson would tell. And so, for example, for Billy Shore, we took language directly from that person and put it into what something that he had used in signing letters and brought it in there. And so there's a question of, is it the personality rather than the message? It may be part message and part messenger, but because the message and the messenger are so inextricably linked, we tested them together because this is a direct quote from Duff Goldman as to how he supports No Kid Hungry. So the personality and the message do go together in terms of voice. You can test just signer, and we have done that for other organizations where the messaging would be the same, but here the voice extends to the message that they would be telling. So we did do it in this case together. Going back to what you provide, you'll see that the number one and the number two messaging are essentially the same. The idea that you can get breakfast, after school, summer meals, but we emphasize the missing meals in the first one, and in the second one we emphasize nutrition hubs, the idea that schools can be a place where you can go to get food throughout the year. People wanted to be delivering the meals rather than the mechanism for delivering those meals. So then those were the five. We have another question. In the research phase, how many people do you go to, and do each respondent get just two different versions. We generally go up to about 3. We go out to your audience in tranches, so we'll send to a few people at a time. We go until we get about 300 completes. Each respondent depends on the size of the grid, but each respondent usually rates between 6 and 10 different A/B tests. So in terms of identity, we see that parents, self-identified foodies, those who had a personal connection to hunger, and those who are religious had higher commitment scores than their counterparts. Commitment scores are a measure that we use. That's a 3-question battery of how committed you are to the organization. That's very predictive of future giving. And so we actually started working with parent identity when looking at journeys from there. We started asking about parent identity, and Erika's going to talk a little bit more of the implementation here. It was one of the 3 high commitment identities. It's not a commitment sensitive question. You can ask someone, are you a parent? And they'll usually answer it. And it lends itself to easy copy versioning. You can say, as a parent, you know you would do anything for your child. And that's something that helps you identify with that person. We do ask demographic questions in the survey, but generally speaking, here is an example, but most of the time throughout pretest tools, these identities come through far more than any demographic differences. Men versus women, white versus non-white, those types of categories generally are swamped by things like, are you a parent or are you not? We find that someone who has a connection to hunger behaves far more like someone else who had a connection to hunger than someone who shares demographic data but didn't have that unique connection to the organization. So the overall winners, you can see them in the grid here. You'll often see sometimes co-winners, like we did with the foodie messaging and the statistics. Sometimes you'll see 3 winners and 2 losers. Sometimes you'll see 1 thing that you absolutely should do and 4 things you absolutely should not. It varies based on the role. So now, let me kick it over to Erika to talk about how it works in real life. Erika?
Hi, everybody. Give me a shout if you can't hear me, but otherwise I'm just going to assume that you can. So I'm really excited to talk to you all about some of the tests that we've done that have resulted from the Pretest tool. I think it was really, really useful for us when we first ran it because we had a new direct mail vendor with Concord. Our program was fairly new, and a lot of our messages were very stats-based and about the organization's impact rather than including kind of emotional stories that demonstrated a donor's impact and those sorts of donor-centric messages. So it was really helpful to kind of lay everything out in this way and say, like, okay, this is clearly what our file wants to see, but let's test it and make sure that it works. So if you want to go to the next slide. So the first thing we did was we were basically like, all right, looks like stories are something that our file wants to hear. Let's test it out. So in our June 2018 acquisition, we basically tested this story about Chris and the difference that summer meals made to him and his brother versus the control from the previous year, which again was very focused on stats and how many children in America don't have food and kind of like the moonshot language of ending childhood hunger. And we also, in a couple of other mailings in 2018, continued to test different stories against the non-emotional controls. And what we found, if you go to the next slide, is that in almost every instance, those stories were super critical in raising both response rate and an average gift. So you can see that Chris' story, 3% higher response rate, 8% higher average gift. In October, we had another story that was about a kid and Thanksgiving dinner and how hard it can be when you live in a house that struggles with hunger around the holidays. So 19% increase in response rate, 14% higher average gift. Basically, the only spot where a story didn't have a positive impact was in our November appeal. When we used stories there, it was against our control, which was pretty institutional and really promoted a matching gift offer very heavily. So this is interesting to us because now we're taking a look at some of our more institutional pieces like this November appeal, like our more transactional renewal series, and saying, okay, is our file expecting us to come at them with these kinds of transactional offers every once in a while? And when we do we necessarily need to include an emotional story? So November, we saw some decreases in response rate and lower average gift. But when we tested it again in December, you know, it's my kind of theory that we scooped up those people who weren't super moved the first time, but as we got closer to year end and as we made more of an emotional plea, those folks were more compelled to give. So I think it just speaks to maybe some of the different types of donors we have on our file, and we're hoping to do more testing around that at year end this year. We also tested kid story, parent identity, and control in ads online. So we did this with two different audiences. Some were just California prospects. We were testing some regionalization language in ads, and then we also tested nationally. So like this says, we basically, the results were pretty close, but we're just going to show the California example so we don't take up too much of your time. So the first one is this parent identity ad. So this is where we slot in as parent. You know, we don't necessarily have parent identity information for all of the folks on our file yet. So it's nice about being able to test this in digital ads is that we have that information from Facebook, and we're able to bear it out there. So as a parent, you may not realize that 1 in 6 kids in America struggles with hunger, but you can help change that. So really appealing to those paternal instincts. The next one is this kid quote. And I think we basically just took it directly from that quote, donate now to give more kids like D the energy to succeed. And then we tested it against this localized California control. So I know that the concept here might be a little bit different from what you're typically doing in digital ads. We really thought of this test as more of like a package test rather than you know, traditional A/B testing. So, you know, what package altogether beats our control, and then from there we can go in and we can tweak the language, we can tweak the pictures and start to A/B test some of those individual elements. But it was important to us to get a read on what was the strongest message across the board. So if you want to go to the next slide. So you can see not only was the click-through rate better for the parent identity and the girls voice ad, the CPAs aren't listed here, but the CPAs were also better for those ads than they were for the control. So really good results. And we've since, like I said, started A/B testing the individual elements of those ads in order to get the most optimized kind of evergreen ad to run. Like Nick said, we had a lot, basically when we were looking through gift scans, when we got surveys back, a lot of people cited their faith in their religion as the reason that they wanted to give to No Kid Hungry, and they felt compelled to help children. So I think it's obviously a risky test for us because we're not a religious organization. And so I'm really glad we had kind of a safe space to test out this messaging and find out that no, this was probably not the path we wanted to go down. And yeah, we all do like our jobs too much to actually do a live test for this. And then another test we did was on the signer. So in the mail, Billy, who's our executive chairman and one of the co-founders of Share Our Strength, he has traditionally been the signer on everything. We tested another institutional signer in July, and there weren't really any differences between the two. So that really helped us out. There was a situation, or basically a letter that we put out that we were asked to not have Billy sign, and we felt pretty comfortable just pivoting and having that other institutional signer sign the letter for us without any huge risk to revenue. So that was really, really helpful. Oh no, you can go ahead. Yeah, and some things we just decided to roll out with because they were so strong in the Pretest tool. So we really use that missing meals language quite a bit. It really seems to resonate with people, and you know, it's an easy message to wrap your head around. We're not directly providing food to kids, but through donors supporting us, we're all able to help kids make sure that they're not missing those school breakfasts or after school meals or summer meals. What the Nutrition Hubs thing was language that other departments were using, and so we were able to share that with them and just say like, hey, this doesn't really resonate as much as you might think it does, so maybe rethink your language, maybe use some of that missing meals verbiage. And we definitely have started including foodie adjectives and phrases. I know people hate the term foodie, but that's kind of our internal way of referring to all of these folks. But you know, healthy, nutritious, fills up their bellies, things like that. And we've also started capturing parent identity during our face-to-face canvassing efforts. So one of the questions that people get asked after they've completed their gift in a post-donation survey is whether or not they're a parent. And we're then able to use that information to version their welcome letter and just reference the fact that they are a parent, and we appreciate their support. So just another way to make a donor feel like we really know who they are and why supporting No Kid Hungry is important to them. And then this is exciting, we just got done with our second round of our Pretest tool. Something that was really encouraging is a lot of the same sort of concepts that won in round one, also won in round two. So it's not like there were a ton of better ideas out there. So now it's just a matter of working on tests that'll help us refine. So yeah, this is really interesting. We have a message where it's just like one child struggling with hunger is too many children. We were able to kind of nail down what formats of equivalencies and symbolic gifts were appealing to the file, so that we can bring those needs to our measurement and planning analysis teams and our comms teams to say, like, you know, when you're developing equivalencies, these are the types of equivalencies that would be really helpful for fundraising. And we also found that our folks love infographics that show, again, their impact and what their dollars can do. So it looks like we have a question. Can you explain further the lack of success with the November appeal, and additionally why it performed better in December? Yeah, so that's a really good question. So like I said, that November appeal message is typically very transactional, and very much there's a matching gift challenge. Can you help us meet the match? And because we interjected stories into it, I think some of the people who were expecting more transactional language probably gave, but didn't give as much or didn't give it at all. I think we send the December appeal as a follow-up to that November appeal. And so I think probably some of the people that we didn't scoop up that first time, maybe that emotionality closer to the holidays, closer to end of year, had a little bit more of an impact. So that's my working theory. I think we're trying to figure out if that's actually what's going on, if it's a transactional versus emotional sort of push-pull at end of year, or during some of our other mailings where we have more transactional language like the renewals. Nick, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
There are a couple other hypotheses that we are playing around with and trying to validate by looking at both the second pretest tool and at some other packages. The first one is that the November package actually featured 3 kids' stories in brief rather than one child's story in depth. And there is some evidence in the behavioral science literature that people are less likely to respond to multiple people's stories at the same time, specifically one that told the story of a boy in Africa, a girl in Africa, and a boy and a girl in Africa. So taking those first 2 stories and combining them. And that last one that you would think would do better actually did the worst of all three. So could have been using the multiple stories. The other one is that those stories that we used in November were not the kind of mission accomplished stories. There wasn't that turn to say your donor gift can help get them meals, nor was there the they can run faster, they can jump higher, they learn better sort of messaging because they have food. They were more of the more negative sounding stories. And so we're looking across packages to see if that may be a consistent factor as well. So two other hypotheses that we are trying to test there.
And then some key takeaways from the second pretest tool that we just completed. That missing meals message is still definitely a consistent winner, so we don't really want to deviate too much from the messaging that we've had there. Like Nick was just saying, many meals for one kid or one meal for many kids works better than trying to say, like, you can provide X number of meals for X number of kids. It works better when there's a set or one kid that you're talking about. People like to know what their impact is, so an infographic or a personal narrative about how a kid was hungry, and then these programs came to their schools and they don't struggle as much with hunger anymore. That's something that people really like. This is really encouraging. We don't have to get super convoluted with our messaging. A simple message beats out a more complicated message, like ending childhood hunger starts at school, is much easier to wrap your head around than schools are a war zone when it comes to fighting childhood hunger. So even just then, it's like a little bit harder to get out when you're describing what the idea is than just ending hunger starts at school. And then again, we saw that positive impact stories, or the positive framing of these stories, really resonates a lot more than just how bad things are. You know, you might trade off getting people to give you money because they feel guilty because a kid's story is so horrible, like the kid who was mixing ketchup and water to make tomato soup. But ultimately, you know, we think based on these answers that the more kids that you show are being helped and the more positive you can frame the stories and the donor impact, the better your results will be.
And we have a hand raiser, so Emily, we're going to allow you to talk right now. Emily, are you there? Emily? Okay. Emily is saying her microphone doesn't work, so Emily, if you can type us your question. My apologies. And we are also open for other questions. In answer to the question that just came in, yes, we will get copies of slides and a recording of the video after the presentation. Sorry, Erika.
Any other questions from anyone? Okay. We will make sure everybody gets a copy of the presentation, as Nick said, and we appreciate everyone spending the
We do have a question that just came in. So is the pre-testing done only by email? Yes, it is generally done only by email. We have done pre-tests previously where we mailed out postcards with a URL on it that would then be taken online. However, those results, it was costly, and those results didn't differ at all from the results that we got from just online testing. And so we generally recommend that clients don't take the extra expense of mailing it. That said, if you do want to incur that expense, we are happy to take in results from however.
But honestly, I mean, I think that, I mean, the email process I've worked with DonorVoice on probably a dozen of these with various clients, and we've never really had an issue. And I think that the donors that participate are pretty good representations in most cases, and you can sort of identify what their giving is to ensure that you've got the right type of audience. Spencer, the process the first time, if you're referring to the overall process in terms of beginning to end, and a lot of that varies. There's a 6 to 8 week timeline. It'll depend on how quickly the creative gets approved back and forth. But I think there's generally, the 6 to 8 week window that's used. Sometimes it extends beyond that. Will depend on how things get approved. Anything you guys want to add to that? Yeah.
We have another question. Do you think the donor email list is a good reflection of your social audience? Generally speaking, we find that people's opinions don't change that much within identity groups. So parents tend to behave like parents. Those who have been impacted by hunger tend to impact or tend to respond like those who have been impacted like hunger across media. That said, your mix may change somewhat. And so it could be that you have on social a more casually affiliated audience than you do with your core donor population. So there may be some differences there, but I would definitely test what you see in a pretest tool in social to see if it works in these sorts of things. And as you saw with Erika's, you did see the things that work for the pretest tool working in social ad space. Erika, Steve, anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I think it depends. I don't know if you've done any kind of social audit in the past to understand how many people, what the people on your email file is actually what they're doing in the social space, and whether they, whether you have a sense of their own interactions. That's obviously something that's done separately from this process, but I would say for the most part, it tends to be a pretty good representation.
Okay, couple more questions. Did we test photos? What kind, looking at donor or other? In this case, we tested only the photos that you saw that went with the voice. So it wasn't a pure imagery test. We have done pure imagery tests before and found some significant results for other clients. In fact, there's one in terms of the looking at. Our behavioral scientist, Dr. Kiki Kumaridu, did a test where she found that people are more likely to opt in if there's a person looking at you rather than looking away. We tend to have greater compliance behaviors if we see a pair of eyes in a room, even if they're virtual eyes. So that's a fun little finding that goes along with that. Are we going to include an example of the pretest tool survey and what we send out? In the slides, you'll see that kind of A/B test. The survey is basically 7 more of those with randomized results, as well as some demographic questions on the back end. So it will be very much like what you've already seen. And then another question, how many examples or questions would be included in the survey or pre-testing? It depends on the size of the grid and all of the things that you want to test. On a 5x5 or 5x6 grid like you see here, there are about 8 plus or minus 2, generally speaking, of the screens where you are rating A versus B. And then on the back end, that can be as long or as short as you want. But generally speaking, we want to throw in identity questions, age, gender, ethnicity, those sorts of things. Erika, anything to add on that?
No, and I think in the email that we send out with the survey, it tells people about how long they can expect to spend taking it, which I think is usually at or right under 10 minutes, Nick?
Yeah, 10,
Yeah.
10 minutes at the most.
Yeah, I think we say 8 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So people know what they're getting into.
Yes. Question, I assume you've done pre-testing for direct mail as well as emails and social media ads. Yes, we've done pre-tests with, in fact, Erika, do you want to talk about the first 5 tests? And those were in mail, correct?
Yep. Yeah, so I mean, I think the specific sort of like package setup where people are rating, do you like A or B better, is kind of, you know, a direct mail setup where you've got a reply device and things like that. But we were able to take a lot of the principles and apply them to ads and an email. So even though it's kind of got a direct mail specific look, our audience is pretty responsive to everything that we've tested out so far, if that makes sense.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. And we do have a question of what the cost is for this. If you'd like to reach out to either Steve or me after the call, we'd be happy to go through that with you. It does vary a bit based on size of donor file, size of grid, amount of creative that we're creating for you.
Audiences that you might go after.
Yeah, so I'd want to be able to put together a better quote for you on that. In terms of number of testers, how many times do you want each variable to be seen by a tester? Okay, now we're getting into the fun back-end stats of this. Generally speaking, what we're trying to do is get every variant, every possible variant of the thousands of variants that you can see with all of these variable combinations to be seen and rated at least once. What that generally means is over 8 tests, you're going to see each variable permutation probably 2 to 4 to 5 times in either the A form or the B form. But there can be statistical anomalies where someone, random chance means that some people are going to not see a variable at all or only see it once, and some people are going to see it a lot of the time. It's just, there's a very particular scientific method that they use to create the grids and come through. We have had rows that have 3 options, which means that that if you have 2 screens every time, then someone's usually seeing, 66% of the possibilities every single time. It does get repetitive for that particular row. Any other questions?
Did you see this? Pam has a question for Facebook tests where they set up with the objective of a C-T or awareness or something else.
Erika, do you want to talk a little bit about the click-through rate and cost per on the Facebook ads?
Yeah, I mean, the call to action was definitely a donation ask, so it wasn't awareness or anything like that. And in terms of the click-through rate and the CPA, compared to the control test, the test ads that we built based off of the Pretest tool definitely outperformed in both of those metrics compared to the control.
And then we have another question, how we determine the winners of the pre-testing. There's a significant statistical analysis on the back end of it, but basically what you're looking at is how many times, think of every time you choose A or B, you're kind of voting for all of the variables in A or B. And so if you had the best possible messaging that everyone loved and everyone picked every time they saw it, regardless of whatever else was going on the screen, you'd discover that that was not only the winner within that row, but that row was the most important thing to how someone decided. Or probably kind of like what you saw with the religious messaging for No Kid Hungry, if someone voted against something every time it showed up, or most of the times it showed up, that row would still be important, but that would be not winning messaging. And then the rows that are the least important are ones where